My husband stood in the living room, his voice raised in frustration. "Why should I have to take care of your mother? She's practically a stranger to me," Neil yelled. My mother, sitting silently, looked lost, her dementia worsening by the day. I took a deep breath, pushing down the hurt. "Fine, Neil. Do what you need to do," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But inside, I knew this was the breaking point. For years, I had tried to hold everything together: our family, our business, and our marriage. But Neil's words felt like the last straw. It wasn't just about my mother. It was about the lack of compassion, the coldness that had slowly crept into our relationship. I realized then that I had been trying to save something that was already gone. I'm Sharon, 50 years old. My life has taken a turn I never imagined. I left my job as an executive at the company my father founded to care for my mother, Mary, who is struggling with dementia. My husband, Neil, the COO of the same company, seems to have no sympathy for our situation. We've been married for 25 years, and now it feels like I'm living with a stranger. Our 2 sons have moved out, started their careers, and it feels like I'm left here to pick up the pieces. Neil used to be my partner, my confidant, but now he was someone I barely recognized. I wondered if he ever truly cared, or if he had always been this cold, and I just refused to see it. 20 years ago, my father passed away suddenly from a heart attack. My mother took over the company, despite her lack of experience, asking the employees for their support. They respected her, not because she was a business genius, but because they admired my father's legacy. The vice president, Dad's trusted colleague, ran most of the operations, and Neil, ambitious as ever, was eager to learn and rise in the company. But over time, his ambition turned into something darker. He became obsessed with power, and his ambition started to overshadow his kindness. I saw glimpses of it back then, but I ignored the warning signs, thinking it was just the pressure of work. After my father died, Neil seemed to think he'd automatically step into the role of president. But my mother never gave him that power. She saw something in him that worried her, a hunger for control that didn't come with the right intentions. Neil's attitude grew colder. He spoke to my mother harshly, as if she was an obstacle in his path. And at work, he began treating the employees poorly, demanding more than they could give and firing people for the smallest mistakes. It was as if he had forgotten what it meant to be part of a team, to lead with empathy. My mother's refusal to promote him only fueled his resentment, and that resentment seeped into every aspect of our lives. My mother, even with her memory slipping, noticed these changes. She tried to counsel Neil, to make him understand the weight of leading a company, that it was about more than just power. But he wouldn't listen. At home, his frustration spilled over into our lives. When our sons were still around, things were easier. Their laughter filled the house, and their presence acted as a buffer between Neil and me. But now, with just me, Neil, and my mother, his words grew harsher, his patience thinner. It was as if he blamed me for everything that wasn't going right in his life. I tried to remind him of the love we once shared, but it felt like I was talking to a wall. Neil would come home late, reeking of alcohol, and his temper would flare at the slightest inconvenience. One night, he stumbled in after midnight. I was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for him. "Neil, we need to talk," I said softly, trying not to wake my mother upstairs. I wanted to reach him, to find some part of the man I had married, but he slumped into a chair, his eyes glazed over. "About what, Sharon? More complaints about your mother?" His dismissive tone cut through me like a knife. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. "She's not just my mother, Neil. She's part of this family, and I need your help. I can't do this alone." I was practically begging, hoping for even a shred of empathy. He laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the empty kitchen. "Family? She doesn't even remember who I am half the time. Why should I care?" His words cut deep, but I swallowed my pride. "Because that's what we do, Neil. We take care of each other. We promise to be there for better or worse." I could see the anger in his eyes, the way his face twisted in frustration. He stood up abruptly, knocking the chair over. "I didn't sign up for this. I'm done, Sharon. I'm moving out." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. The next morning, he was gone. He left a note on the counter, scribbled hastily, "I need space. Don't try to contact me." I sat at the table, staring at the note, feeling a mix of anger and relief. Part of me was devastated, but another part felt lighter. Maybe now, without Neil's constant criticism, I could focus on what really mattered, caring for my mother. After Neil left, I found myself alone in caring for my mother. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. I hired a home care nurse to help a few days a week, but most of the burden fell on me. One afternoon, while tidying my mother's room, the nurse found an old leather-bound notebook beside her bed. "Sharon, look at this," she said, handing it to me. It was my father's journal. I hadn't seen it in years. I opened it hesitantly, and tears filled my eyes as I read his words. He wrote about his dreams for the company, his worries about Neil, and his hope that the company would stay in safe hands. In one of the last entries, he had written, "Never let Neil become president." It hit me like a punch in the gut. My father had seen through Neil long before I did. The realization was both painful and clarifying. I had been blind to Neil's true nature for so long, but my father had known. Later, I found a note in my mother's shaky handwriting. "Sharon, I trust you. Stop Neil." My heart sank. Even in her moments of confusion, my mother had tried to protect me and the company. I knew I had to act. I called my son, Dylan, and told him everything. He listened quietly, then said, "Mom, don't worry. We'll handle this together." Hearing his confidence gave me strength. I realized that I wasn't alone. Dylan was with me, and together, we could face whatever came our way. The following week, I requested an emergency company meeting. All the employees gathered in the conference room, and Neil sat there with a smug smile, assuming he would finally get what he wanted. I stood up, my mother's proxy in hand, and announced that due to my mother's illness, we needed to appoint a new president. "I propose we make the vice president, who has faithfully led us for years, the new president," I said. The room erupted in applause, but Neil shot up from his chair, shouting, "This is ridiculous! She can't make decisions in her state." His face was red with anger, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. I held up my father's journal. "These are my father's words. He never wanted you to lead this company," I said. Neil turned pale. The room fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in. Then one of the accountants stood up. "I have something to add," he said. "Neil has been making unauthorized withdrawals from company funds. I demand his immediate dismissal." The color drained from Neil's face, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Just then, Dylan walked in. He projected an image onto the screen, a photo of Neil with another woman entering an apartment. "You've been using company money for your personal life, Dad," Dylan said calmly. Neil looked defeated. The vice president called for a vote, and every hand in the room went up, except Neil's. He turned to me, his face twisted in anger. "I should never have married you," he spat, before storming out. I watched him leave, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. The man I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. After the meeting, Dylan approached me. "Mom, I want to help. Let me join the company," he said. I hesitated, not wanting him to give up his own dreams, but Dylan smiled. "Grandpa built this company. I want to make it better," he said. Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness but from pride. My son was ready to take on the challenge, to bring new ideas and energy into the company. Neil and I divorced soon after. He struggled to find work, his reputation ruined by his own actions. He tried to leverage his past connections for a new job, but word of his embezzlement had spread, and no one would associate with him. Eventually, he ended up doing menial jobs just to make ends meet. It was a sad downfall for someone who once had so much potential. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was barely scraping by, living in a small apartment, isolated from the world he once dominated. It was hard to reconcile this version of Neil with the man I had once loved, but I knew that his choices had led him here. Meanwhile, Dylan breathed new life into the company, bringing in new talent and modernizing our approach. Dylan was full of ideas, from updating our technology to creating a more inclusive company culture. One day, he shared some happy news. He was engaged to his college sweetheart, and she was joining our company too. Despite everything, the legacy my father built was safe, and our family was healing. The worst part of my life had given me the best outcome, a son who made me proud every single day. A few months after Dylan took over, the company started to thrive in ways I hadn't seen in years. Employees were happier, productivity was up, and there was a sense of optimism in the air. Dylan had a natural talent for leadership, something Neil never had. He listened to the employees, valued their input, and made them feel like they were part of something bigger. It was everything my father would have wanted, and it filled me with a sense of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. One evening, as I sat in my mother's room, she looked at me with a rare moment of clarity. "Sharon," she said softly, "you've done well." I held her hand, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered. In that moment, I knew that all the sacrifices, all the pain, had been worth it. My mother may not remember everything, but she knew, deep down, that her family was safe and her husband's legacy was secure. Dylan continued to amaze me. He brought in a young programmer who helped us transition to a more digital-focused operation. The company started using advanced software for planning and production, making processes faster and more efficient. We even began experimenting with 3D printing, something I knew nothing about but which fascinated Dylan. He was determined to bring the company into the future, and I was happy to support him in any way I could. One day, Dylan came to me with a proposal. "Mom, I think we should expand," he said, excitement in his voice. "There's a market we haven't tapped into yet, and I think it could be a game changer for us." I listened as he laid out his plan, impressed by his vision and determination. It was clear that he had inherited my father's entrepreneurial spirit. As we moved forward, I found myself taking on a new role within the company. I wasn't the executive I used to be, but I was a mentor, a guide for the younger generation. I helped Dylan and his team navigate the challenges of running a business, offering advice when needed, but also giving them the space to make their own decisions. It was rewarding in a way I hadn't expected. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that I was contributing to something meaningful. Neil, on the other hand, had faded into the background. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was struggling, moving from one low-paying job to another. He had lost everything: his career, his family, his reputation. It was hard to believe that this was the same man I had once loved, the man I had built a life with. But people change, and sometimes they become someone you no longer recognize. Dylan's wedding was a beautiful affair. He and his fiancée Emily were glowing with happiness. As I watched them exchange vows, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Despite all the turmoil, we had made it. Our family had survived, and we were stronger for it. My mother, though frail, was there too, sitting quietly and smiling. She may not have fully understood what was happening, but she knew it was a joyful day. After the wedding, Dylan and Emily threw themselves into their work, determined to take the company to new heights. They were a perfect team, balancing each other out and bringing fresh ideas to the table. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome. The company my father built was in good hands, and I knew that his legacy would live on for generations to come. Looking back, I realized that the challenges I faced had shaped me into a stronger person. I had learned to stand up for myself, to fight for what was right, and to protect the people I loved. Neil's betrayal had been painful, but it had also been a catalyst for change, a change that ultimately led to something better. One day, as I was packing away some old things, I came across a photo of Neil and me from our early days together. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. I felt a pang of sadness for what could have been, but I quickly pushed it aside. Life had taken us down different paths, and I was finally at peace with that. Dylan walked into the room, catching me with the old photo. He smiled gently. "Mom, you've come a long way," he said. I nodded, feeling a sense of closure. "We both have," I replied, setting the photo aside. It was time to focus on the future. A future that was bright, full of promise, and led by the next generation. Despite all the hardship, I was grateful. Grateful for my mother's strength, for my father's wisdom, and for my son's resilience. The company was thriving, my family was healing, and I knew that the best was yet to come. The worst husband may have left, but the best legacy remained, and that was more than enough.